For those of you who accompanied us on the walk, I know I asked on the walk too, but if any thoughts or comments, responses, things that worked and didn't work for you, yes, Kurt, winner.
We were just talking about how, at least for this instance that you provided, like the number of quests was a little bit overwhelming if you were like kind of zooming in, like the requirement of knowing, kind of like trusting your location dot or knowing the map well enough made it so the density of quests was maybe a little bit challenging to be like, I know that I can speak to this pathway specifically. So either like some way of clustering the quests in a way that's like either a linear route or something that gives some, I don't know, spatial clues or ways to confirm that you're like, entering information for the right quest, I think would be valuable.
That's really good input. And we've tried to address that in the accessibility. There's a button on the top tool set that allows you to press the accessibility button, and that reduces the number of quests to just like the top 5 that are closest to you. What we're working on next is to really do what you're talking about, which is highlighting on the map what this references more specifically and how you are standing in relation to that. But this is really good feedback that we're still on the path, not at the end goal.
Have like one other small thing, but it was, on the ramp, it was like, is this textured or not? And you noted that it was kind of a trick question because it was, a friction like pattern, but it wasn't actually the standard textured. So I was just thinking in the wild, like I might not know how to answer that correctly. So either like another visual clue on that cue on that question or something might be helpful as well.
Agreed. So I think in general, when we design the data structures, we intend to sort of have that participatory conversation about what different options should be even shown in the visual response. So that's really, we kind of wanted to have everything kind of lined, so there were 3 options, but I agree with your feedback, absolutely.
So I'll also note, in the app settings, you can filter for what types of quests you want. So especially in a very dense area, there's a million pins, right? You can go into the settings and say, oh, I only want to answer questions about curb ramps, for example, and that can kind of cut down on some of the visual noise there. And yes, as you're saying with the quest definitions, I happen to know because I wrote that one, it's completely flexible. We can add in any images. You can change the descriptions at the quest level to say, here's an example of what is tactile paving, those like truncated dome tactile warning, versus what is this like surface roughness treatment. So that is all configurable. And thank you so much for your feedback.
So I'd like to, oh, sorry, yes.
I have a small thing just related to what Kurt was describing. So the blue dot is layered like below the quests, and so it's hard to see where you are. And then the other thing was that when you're trying to like move the map so that you can get to a different area or try to find where your blue dot is, it's difficult to do that because there's so many quests. You select them as you're trying to move. You have to touch just the map part that doesn't have a quest on it. So I think in other maps what I've seen is like sometimes if you use 2 fingers, like you're able to move without selecting like in this instance, the quest. And so I think that could be a helpful way to do that because it was hard to, constantly selecting quests.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I won't, there's a whole discussion. We used to have it with 2 fingers and not everybody was used to that standardized way of moving maps. So whether to explain it or actually, UX, UI is difficult.
All right, we've got one from Tanisha.
Hey everyone. I think kind of in relation to the last comment, a location centering button. Is there one? Yeah, because sometimes I lose my blue dot, and then I have to go like swimming around to look for it. So that would be helpful.
This is a more technical thing. I'm not using a standard OS, so I'm currently in the EOS system, and I wasn't able to download or access it from the website and all that stuff. And so that's something that also might be coming up soon, is the more people get away from Android and Apple products, or Google and Apple products, it might be more challenging to figure out, the stuff, because, yeah, couldn't participate.
Thank you. Noted. Okay. I think we're ready to transition. I want to acknowledge the team that made this happen. So we have Sam, Tanisha, Amara over there. We have Kunal at the front here. Jeff and Amy in the back. Sai and Ryan and Himanshu in the back. And Pam, who really made this day happen. So thank you. No, it takes a whole host of people to bring these conversations to the fore. And I want to acknowledge you all for persevering through 2 days of talking about how important it is to elevate non-drivers in our experience. And of course, this conversation would not be complete without our next speaker. Anytime I bring up sidewalks, have you talked to Anna Zivarts? The author of When Driving is Not an Option is here to discuss this with us today, and she'll be talking from insight to agency, how non-drivers move policy, and she promises us a very interactive session, so please get ready. Thank you so much, Anna Zivarts.
Thanks, Anat. There we go. Awesome. And apologize I couldn't be here this morning. I was at the National Federation of the Blind has their annual conference that was happening today too, and it was sort of my chance to get out and meet people from all over the state. And right before I came here, I was trying to get here a little earlier, and a woman came up to me who lives in Skyway, between Skyway and SeatTac, kind of an area without a lot of sidewalks. She's blind, and was describing to me her frustrations with getting around. And I was telling her I was going to this other conference, and she was so excited about it. And I know it's Friday afternoon. You guys have been in a conference room for 2 days, but I am really excited from that energy from Heather, who shared her experience with me. So stay tuned. We'll be doing an event with her, I'm pretty sure, sometime soon in the future, because she was so passionate about sidewalks and access. So I'm going to talk you through some slides today, but it's also going to be super interactive. I know when some of you hear the words interactive, you're like, oh no, I just want to crawl back into my little bubble and zone out. So no one has to speak, but I do encourage you to share your experiences with us today. As a practice of accessibility, I am going to try to verbally describe all the content of my slides, but yell at me if I'm missing something, or you have any questions. This can be super interactive. So this first slide, Anat read the title, but the title of my presentation is on there, From Insight to Agency, How Non-Drivers Move Policy. It's got my name on there. I'm with the Nondrivers Alliance. We're a new nonprofit that does both Washington state work and then some national, international organizing as well. And the image on the slide is some folks standing in a large semicircle and talking about my favorite intersection of all times, I-90 and Rainier, and how to address the ramp situation there. This was a walk-roll event, I think during Week Without Driving in 2024 maybe. There's been so many. I think Tanisha and Amar are in this picture. I know my colleague Cecilia is. It was a big event. So just to sort of tell you where I came from, and if I know many of you have heard this before because you know me, but if you don't know me, this is sort of my backstory. And I do have a new childhood photo. Every time I go home to my parents' house, I mine their photo albums for more awkward photos of my youth, and found this one. This is me. I grew up in Washington State. I grew up on a road. This is the road I grew up on. This is the road my parents still live on. It's the picture on the right. It's a rural road, no sidewalks, no shoulders, tall trees. I don't like trees very much. I find them claustrophobic. And I was born with a condition called nystagmus. And so when I was younger, I had a head tilt. You can see in this photo on the left. To be able to see better, I lifted my head. And over time, that was corrected through wearing prism glasses, which are pretty miserable glasses that make you, it like adjusts your whole field of vision. And so I tripped on everything all the time. But I don't have a head tilt as much. I have a disability that probably is less visible unless you know what to look for. And so sometimes when I'm holding this today, sometimes I use this white cane at times, not because I need it for mobility as much as that I need to signal to people that I can't see for safety reasons, definitely going through airports. I've had some incidents with TSA, anything where it's sort of like a high-stress security situation. And then also I use it at big events where, across a room, if you wave at me, I'm not going to be able to see you. And if you don't know this about me, you're going to think I'm rude. And so I talk about that white cane use because I think it's important to normalize it a bit for people who are perhaps on the spectrum of vision. Because I think there's a lot of can I use a white cane even if I can still see a little bit? Questions that many of us in this sort of low vision community have. So that's me, that's where I came from. I was not able to drive growing up. I tried to take the vision test or the driver's test at the DMV when I was 16. I failed it. I was determined I was going to learn how to drive anyway. I drove my friend's car up a tree in a parking lot at Evergreen State College, and that really scared me. And it was a good thing because it scared me out of thinking that I could drive when I couldn't. So I then lived in New York City for many years, and in 2018 I moved back here to Washington State to take a job at Disability Rights Washington, which is where I worked for around 8 years. And I was really appreciative. At Disability Rights Washington, I had the freedom and support to start a storytelling project around the experience of people who can't drive. Right away when I was hired there, I was on a team doing video production, and I met some of my coworkers, and all of them were disabled, and most of them couldn't drive, and it felt so exciting to me for the first time in my life to be around other disabled folks who shared that experience of transportation barriers. And so it sent me on this journey to want to go out and document those stories, not just among my coworkers, but other people in Seattle and then other people around the state. And so as the pandemic started and a lot of our in-person video work fell away, I lobbied my boss to be able to do this project, which we called the Transportation Access for Everyone Story Map. And this image on the screen is an image of that story map. It's still on the DRW website. You can go there. There's around 300 interviews of non-drivers from every legislative district in the state. The lead image here is of Crystal Monteros, who is one of the first people I was able to hire to help me connect with her network and help me do these interviews. And I think through Crystal, I met Tanisha a long time ago. And so these stories are up there. And in doing this work, I started to really think about, well, what does it mean to be disabled, to not have transportation access? How do we want to define this experience? Because people would come to me and say, well, I can't drive because I'm disabled and I'm low income, and it's my disability. I can't work because of my disability, but I could drive if I could afford a car. Can I still do this project? And it got really hard to sort of define, who was not driving because of a disability and who was not driving for other reasons. And I started to see that it didn't really matter to make those distinctions, that if we started to define ourselves more broadly around this identity of non-driver, we could advocate for solutions that would help all of us together move around our communities. All of us need sidewalks to move safely next to traffic, right? All of us need safe crossings where the car speeds are low enough, where we have the ability to safely get from one side of the street to the other. We need transit or paratransit to get where we need to go. We need community ride services if we're in a more rural area. So trying to sort of create this new sense of ability to advocate together, regardless of whether we identified as disabled or not, regardless of whether we could afford a car or not, whether we could afford a car that met our access needs, regardless our age. So this next slide, I want to ask you all to interact. This is your first interactive opportunity. To think about who you know in your life who can't drive or can't afford to drive or is too young to drive or is aged out of driving or maybe prefers not to drive. And go ahead and raise your hands. I have some mic runners that are going to help me call on people. Does anyone want to be bold and share?
Got one over here.
All right.
Mine is my daughters who aren't old enough to drive, but they also enjoy taking the bus and taking the link and things like that.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. Is that Clara? I can't. Yes. Hi. Thanks for breaking the ice. All right. Who else wants to share? Yeah.
Hi, this is David Miller over here from the Lighthouse for the Blind.
Hi,
And
David.
of course, I have lots of friends who I've known for years who identify as visually impaired and also deaf as well. And they are actively using public transit every day
Yeah.
and struggle with it.
Yeah. All right. And if it's your experience too, you can share. You can raise your hand. This is about, yeah, all of us. All right. Anyone else want to? Yes.
I also can't drive because of a vision impairment. And I increasingly know more and more people who are like like they could if they had to, but experience like a ton of anxiety when it comes to driving. And so they have, they had a driver's license when they were a teenager, but are not interested in it now.
Yeah, no, and that's been something I've heard a lot, and it's interesting to me as I've gone out and sort of had these conversations with people around the U.S. and Canada, how many people, like, there is this profound anxiety around driving and stress, and sometimes it's like post-traumatic stress from crashes, but sometimes it's just the stress of it and that pressure. Any other examples of people you know in your life or in your community who don't drive or can't drive or choose not to drive?
We've got a knot over here.
Yes.
Hi, Anat from TCAT. So much of the time when we're talking about travelers, we think about single people. My experience, in my family group, it's a group.
Yeah.
And we have to accommodate all of the needs. There's a person with a wheelchair and someone else who's got a different limitation. And so I think it's important to think of groupings, too, when we talk about these issues.
Yeah. Remember, I'm going to tell a story. I hope this is an okay story, but when we first met, I remember us talking about, disability and access, and you referred to, like, you and your family as a we, like, we have this experience, and I was like, so, rah, it's if you're not disabled yourself, you don't have that experience, but, being a parent and, in a family unit, right, that is, like, you are moving as a we, right, and, yeah, so, anyway. Anything else? Anyone else? I think there was one over here.
We have Brian.
I am lucky enough that I can drive. I just don't want to, and I do have a stress of going anywhere I've never been because of parking. I have a Sprinter van that does garages, as most people here have heard. So I use public transportation as much as I can. I happen to live in a good transit area, but doesn't mean I don't run into issues.
Thank you. Yeah, and I heard some of your Sprinter van, the parking garage comment yesterday, and that is mind-blowing about those parking garage levels at Sound Transit. So, yeah, and I think I want to point out a picture here I have on the screen of Erica, who's on the upper right, who lives in Seattle now, used to live up further north, and is a power chair user. And she can drive, but she can't afford a car that fits her power wheelchair, that accommodates her power wheelchair. And so she, when I interviewed her originally, had like a car that she could drive places, but she couldn't get out of the vehicle then and go anywhere. And I share Erica's story because I think it's an important example of that it's not like a strict binary, right? And that this sort of driving access piece can be much more nuanced. And that, also there's sort of, for people who can drive with mobility disabilities, right, that complexity of the parking piece, the stress of sort of transferring in and out of chairs if you have to do that to be able to drive. And then, getting from where there is that parking to where you need to be. And Dorian said he was okay sharing this story. Dorian, I don't know where you are in the room, but if you want to share a little bit about your experience getting here today, we were texting as I was on the train trying to come up here about this. Yeah.
Yeah, so the suggested disability parking, the hub, which is closer by, was full. So I went to the other lot, but there's no accessible pathway from the lot to here. So I was texting Anna and other people that I knew here, trying to find how to get from there to here, and the only option was to push in the road up the hill. There was a sidewalk, but the sidewalk wasn't consistently accessible. But like I can get up curbs with the chair, but there's a limit to that, and so and it's not safe to just like go off and on the curbs. It's safer to just be in the road. So someone had to come and push me up the hill and around here. So now I've got to go back down that hill in the road to get back. So yeah, and it was stressful. I almost left.
I know. Just understanding that, like, you know, if you don't have that same sort of walk out your door, grab the keys and go, you know, walk out of your car, park, like, transportation becomes so much more defining of what's possible in your life. And we're going to talk a lot of those pieces a little bit more in a minute. But before we do, I want to finish describing some of the images on the screen that sort of illustrate some of the other groups of non-drivers. So I talked about Erica. Claire mentioned your kids. Kids on the upper left, there's my kid and another kid on our block waiting for the school bus. Kids need to go places too, and not all kids are going to drive. It was interesting, as I was tabling today, a family came up and I was telling about, you know, they had a young kid who was blind, and they're like, oh, we're a long way away from driving. And I was like, well, you're actually like a very long way away from driving. Your kid is, and probably won't drive, and maybe we should talk about making transit work better. But, you know, not all kids are going to drive, and many, you know, they can't drive now. Young people as well, right, are also non-drivers. The picture on the bottom right is some young people, high school students at Franklin High School, waiting for the bus in Seattle. Young people who are old enough to drive but don't have a license, that percentage is increasing quite a bit. In the generation from when I was a teenager in the 90s, 50% of 16-year-olds got driver's licenses in the US. Now it's 25%. So a big decrease in that sort of like going out and getting your license right away. I don't have the like research on why. I think a lot of it has to do with cost and affordability, but also I think the stress and anxiety of driving and maybe folks having other options. The picture on the middle is folks on the 7 bus, again in my neighborhood. This was during the pandemic when a lot of our transit routes cleared out and there was less ridership. But on routes that served low income and non-white communities and immigrant communities, that ridership remained really high, and that, you know, all over the U.S. And that's because people don't have other choices. People, you know, are sharing multiple adults in one household sharing a car. Maybe households don't have cars. And so transit and getting around without being able to drive is really important. And then on the bottom left is a picture of my grandma, folks who are aging out of driving, and especially as the boomer generation sort of reaches that point, is another big demographic of non-drivers. And, you know, many of them, like, you could say, okay, they're disabled, they've got a disability, that is causing them not to be able to drive, but they would not choose to self-identify as disabled. And so I sort of have them in their own category to, you know, not force them to have to make that, to identify that way. So altogether, non-drivers make up about 1/3 of the U.S. population. This is new research from NRDC that came out in October, and they found that 36.6% of people over the age of 10 in the U.S. don't have reliable access to a car. Let's see, in Washington State, so you can break it down by state. In Washington State, they found 32% of Washington State residents are non-drivers. And this is a map on the behind this text. You can go to the NRDC website if you Google NRDC no car households and look at this. The darker the color, the less car access a household has. And, you know, so there's some darker places around some of our major cities, but there's also a lot of darker areas in rural areas, in Rust Belt cities and in the rural South. So I encourage you to go there and poke around at that data. It's really interesting. They also found that 73% of people with disabilities don't drive for most of our trips, which I think is another interesting statistic to keep in mind. In Washington State, we have similar data. This is from 2023. This was from the non-driver study done by the JTC. You can get this by Googling JTC non-drivers study. Again, I think what's really interesting to notice is some of the darker areas with higher percentages of non-driver populations are our rural areas, are our agricultural areas, and our tribal areas of the state. So just noticing that. This next image, this is from the JTC study, so this is Washington State. They did a statistically representative survey of non-drivers in Washington State, and this is non-driver survey response primary reason for not driving. And I'm actually going to get into my screen so I can read these to you real quick. Let's see. So the cost of vehicle and maintenance, that's the main one, right, at 40%. 28% cost of vehicle registration. So you take those two together and it really is like a cost burden thing. Some other things to call out, let's see, disability or condition that prevents driving is 19%. And then prefer a lifestyle without a car is 17%. And then there's some other categories is to doesn't know how to drive or can't afford the cost of a driver's license, 14%. Other, or prefer not to say, are the remaining percent. So you can see that cost really is a major barrier for people overall from this Washington State survey. This next slide, this is percentage of non-drivers that travel for daily life activities by most common travel modes. Again, I encourage you to go to this data because I don't want to go into it too deeply. But really, most non-drivers are relying on friends and family for rides, which even in Washington State with our relatively good transit. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Another piece, just thinking about how that impacts non-drivers, and this is from the same research. Female, younger, and lower income non-drivers were worried about inconveniencing others, skipped going somewhere, were late going somewhere, worry about being able to get somewhere more due to their non-driver status than their male, older, and higher income peers. So even within the non-driver category, there's disparate impacts of that non-driver status. So if you want to dig into that report, dig in there. It's really interesting. What I want to get into now is some of the impacts of not being able to drive, and some of the things we can do about it, and then we'll continue the conversation into how that connects to what you've heard today, and how we can start to change this. So this next slide is really talking about that relying on friends and family, which is for especially involuntary non-drivers, like those of us who maybe aren't choosing to live in Capitol Hill because that's not something we can afford to do or just doesn't work for our family situation. Relying on friends and family is often how we're getting around. And this is a quote from Jaime Torres, who used to live in the Tri-Cities in the Pasco area. The picture on the top is him pointing out a sidewalk in his neighborhood that he couldn't get through with his chair. And then for these quotes, I'm going to do this as an interactive exercise. I'm going to have someone read the quote, read Jaime's quote, and then share a time when you had to ask someone for a ride and what that felt like. And you can be someone who normally drives places, and but I'm sure we've all had experiences where we had to get rides in our lives. So does anyone want to share Jaime's quote?
Joe here. I used to be able to go to the Heritage Flight Museum in Skagit County because I used to, my dad used to be able to drive me there and back, and he needs to smoke, let's just say, a substance to take the stress off of his PTSD. So asking him to bring me back at 4 o'clock is a huge burden. So I don't go anymore, and my local transit doesn't serve there on the weekends. So I'm kind of out. I mean, we need to stress when we communicate about public transit that for some people, this is our lifeline. And I'm not the only one saying this. Recently, Transit Unplugged with Paul Comfort recommended that when we talk about transit funding, we talk about the people who, honest to God, need public transit just to live our lives. And I'll leave you with that thought and hand the next person. Thank you.
Can you read Jaime's quote for me? Can you read that?
The podcast is Paul Comfort's Transit Unplugged.
Oh, no, sorry. The quote on the screen. Can you read Jaime's quote?
Yeah. It is beyond frustrating having to depend on others for transportation. It really affects me to the point where it's easier to just isolate myself in my room so I don't feel like a burden, end quote. Jamie Torres.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks for sharing your experience. Which I think links into this next slide very nicely. Transit is freedom, right? When it's hard to get places, when those family networks don't work for us, when it is one favor too many. I was speaking to someone last week who was in a domestic violence situation as she lost her vision and had to navigate that while trying to rely on her partner for rides until she was able to get hooked into her local paratransit system. So for so many of us, transit is freedom. This is a picture of Abby Griffith, who's someone else I worked with at Disability Rights Washington. The picture on the top is her in the rural community she grew up in Ridgefield, Washington. And then the bottom picture is her in Vancouver, Washington, where she was able to move eventually to get better transit access. So I'm going to have someone volunteer to read Abby's quote and then share with me an example of a time that you were able to take transit somewhere and it felt like freedom.
All right, Chelsea in the back over here.
All right.
From HopeLink, Find a Ride. So Abby's quote, "The room I rented was right next to the bus number 30. It was life-changing for me to know that I have access to places." So I'm going to tell a story of, so I work a lot with the justice-impacted community, and if I've talked to you here, the horse is being beat, but I will beat it some more. I help coordinate people when they get released. And so I often pick people up or I help them get a ride. Sometimes people, they are given $40 and a bus ticket. Sometimes they're not given anything at all. Sometimes they're given an ORCA card, sometimes they are not. People that have access to an ORCA card or other types of transportation have reentry success at numbers at like 87% last I checked, because they can get to work, they can go home, they can do all the things they need to do. When they don't have that, a lot of times they find themselves right back in the justice system because they can't check in with their probation officer, they can't get to work, or they can't do all of the things that our system requires them to do. So you talked about freedom. In the justice world, it actually is freedom, having sometimes access to transportation.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow. It makes me think about the situation in Buffalo, too, that I'm reading about in the news. I'm not going to go into it right now because I don't know the details well enough. But, yeah, sometimes not having that transportation is also, deadly. So I want to, this is sort of getting into the sidewalk piece of this, and this is something that, as someone who doesn't use a wheelchair, and before I had a kid and, pushed him around in the stroller, I didn't think about this piece as much. And as I met Crystal, whose picture you saw earlier, Crystal Monteros, and started working at Disability Rights Washington and meeting more coworkers and friends who used wheelchairs, this piece really became, the importance of that sidewalk connectivity to transit really became much more apparent to me. So I'm going to describe the two images on the screen, and I'm going to have someone then read Crystal's quote and describe to me, you can start thinking of this now, describe to me a bus stop near you that you know of that lacks really good transit sidewalk connectivity. So this picture on the upper right, this is JR and Kat, who live out in Bremerton, and this was out on Kitsap Peninsula. I think this was near Silverdale. We were visiting a friend of theirs, and this was the bus stop, which is this gravel pit, and Kat's in a power wheelchair and is low vision as well, and so and JR has a service dog, and so we were waiting on the side of the road for the bus, but Kat had to stay in this rural road because if she pulled into the gravel where the bus stop was, she'd tip her chair or get stuck. And it was a really scary road. It was super fast. It was rural. Cars were whizzing by us, and really not a comfortable place to wait. And then on the bottom left is a picture of Crystal outside her apartment complex in Tacoma, where she's talking to some elected officials about the missing sidewalk that needs to connect her bus stop to the corner so she can cross to her apartment. So does someone want to read Crystal's quote and then tell me an example of a bus stop near you that's missing sidewalk connectivity?
We'll go over here.
We need to start thinking about public transportation and sidewalks as going together instead of as two separate things. You can't use the bus if you can't get yourself to the bus stop. Crystal Monteros. It's not near me, but one of the destinations, I had to take my autistic son up from Columbia City in southeast Seattle up to northeast Seattle to Ryther. And looked like there was a great bus connection, but that little last block problem, it was 35 miles an hour. And I know you know this project. I'm really proud of it. One of the youth that was at Ryther managed to go to Seattle City Council and advocate for that one block, that death-defying, most terrifying, like 5 minutes of my life when walking with my son, a 40-mile-an-hour road, really no shoulder, trying to put him on the left so at least I'd get hit first. That there's so many of those bus stops, and at Metro we want to change that. We know, that's why we're here.
Thank you. Yes, that bus stop. That was one when I went with. So yeah, I met Charlie. Charlie was a student who was an intern with me at Disability Rights Washington through the DSB student intern program, and he was also got services at Ryther, right? And he described to me that experience, and then I went up there, and oh my gosh, it was. Especially because Ryther, it serves so many youth who probably are going to be transit riders for a good chunk of their lives, and families who rely on transit as well, and to get there involving that missing chunk of sidewalk was gnarly. But it got fixed. The city somehow pulled the coins out of the couch cushions, and it was like a 2-year project, which never happens. So you can go there now and connect on the sidewalk. So I want to talk about crossings, and I mentioned this is my favorite intersection. This is I-90 in Seattle at Rainier, where the Judkins Park Light Rail Station is about to open in just a few on the 28th of March. So very soon. I started caring about this area when my kids started going to preschool there, and I would have to cross these unsignalized on and off ramps to get to the bus stop after dropping them off at the preschool or after picking them up. And so this picture on the right is a group of folks crossing one of these crosswalks in a walk roll event that we had. And then the picture on the left is Micah Lusignan, who's a blind transit rider in Seattle who was doing a walk roll event up there with me. And he walked up to what he thought was like an accessible pedestrian button to push to get a signal to cross. And it's just a sign that says use caution while crossing with a little bike and pedestrian signal on it. So I'm going to have someone read Micah's quote and then tell me an example of a crossing near you or that you encounter on a regular basis that doesn't feel like it's prioritizing the movement of pedestrians. I'm sure there are millions.
Okay. Oh, one over here.
Hi, I'm Sanatina, and Micah's quote, "So they can't see us and I can't see them. That's tough." And I live in a very good transit location next to the Capitol Hill Light Rail Station. And I want to highlight that there is supposedly a pedestrian plaza and focused area right outside one of the exits. And it is not really well designed so that it usually is used for a parking lot or deliveries, and there are people like trying to speed through it to get to the light, instead of it being sort of a Festival Street Wooner style pedestrian plaza that it was designed for.
Yeah, it's confusing what that space is supposed to be, right? Because it, needs some more clarity. Thank you, Sanatina. Okay, we're going to get into solutions real quick, soon. But before we do, the last part I want to touch on is just that, we're talking right now and more broadly in this conference around transportation. And really, transportation is just like half of the equation of getting what you need, right? The other half of it is, where is that thing, right? And is it close to where you can afford to live? Or does that service exist in your community? And so there's two images here. The top one, I mentioned my grandma, who, on the very first slide, who was aged out of driving. She lived in a rural community, and rather than not driving and being forced to move into a nursing home, she kept driving and kept on driving off the road. road when she would pass out unexpectedly. But this is an image of what used to be the hardware store in that community where she lived. Used to be a fully functional, small town in rural southern Indiana. And as the highway got built and it became faster and cheaper for people who could drive to go into the larger town to the Walmart, everything local closed. And so when she was unable to drive anymore, suddenly there were no longer any services, right? And so she had to make that drive on the highway to go get groceries. And this is true for so many, both communities in rural areas, but also communities in urban areas, right? Where we have food deserts and pharmacy deserts and healthcare deserts. The nearest 24-hour pharmacy in Seattle is in Issaquah, which just kills me. So that's part of it, right, is how do we get those services into the places where people need them closer so that the distances aren't so far that we have to travel. The second piece is making housing more affordable. And this bottom image on the left is near the Othello station in Seattle. These are new townhomes that are, all selling for around $800,000, which is out of the range of most of the people that I organize with, who would love to live within light rail in Seattle, but within walking or rolling distance. But what is affordable there is not really available. There's a quote here from Vaughn Brown, who's someone who used to live in the greater Vancouver area, and then was priced out as housing prices in Portland went up and up, and now lives in Spokane. So I'm going to have someone read Vaughn's quote. And share an example of either the top example or this other example of, either services that are not located in communities where they need to be, or of housing being out of reach, housing that's connected to transit or connected to sidewalk networks.
Hi. I'm Taryn. I work for King County Metro, and I live up in Snohomish County. I'll read the quote first.
Yep.
More affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation. I live in a suburban neighborhood, but the closest bus stop is about 1.5 miles from my house. And I have 2 little kids who just they're not going to walk 1.5 miles. And actually, I use transit to get to work. And there is, we're on the closest bus line is a major bus route up in CT World. That is very useful, but getting there with my kids means people with small kids, that's a really far way to go. And I have a 6-year-old who doesn't need a stroller, but to walk the 3 miles total of getting there and then doing the thing for the day and then walking back is just not realistic. And my youngest, her daycare is on the way to that bus stop, but I can't, anyway, the logistics of the pickups and the drop-offs when you're 1.5 miles away from a bus stop is really complicated. And if it were just me, I could make that work a lot better. But for families, there's a lot more factors at play.
Thank you. And I think, 1.5 miles, yeah, for some of us, maybe that's a distance that's travelable. And for many, many people, right, for a whole host of reasons, it's not. And in places where, where we're further out, that's where the transit access is. That's where the affordable housing is. So I want to pivot and make sure we have time to talk about solutions. So how do we make visible and normalize non-driving is this next question. And I'm going to ask you to respond to this. And the reason I'm going to ask you to respond to this is because I think it helps us start to have the conversation of how do we make it politically possible to prioritize sidewalks, right? That recognize that people are moving outside of vehicles and need to do that safely and comfortably. This picture on the screen is Tiara and Cecilia, former coworkers, friends of mine, on a paratransit vehicle during Week Without Driving last year. So does anyone want to share how do we normalize? Any ideas for how to normalize non-driving, how to make it more visible, how to make it feel like it's not this sidebar on everything else or normal transportation?
All right, I've got an answer over here.
Yeah.
I really appreciate when events or even going to someone's house for the first time, when they provide information about how to get there that is not just where parking is. And even like when I tell people to come to my house, I have like, this is the bus nearby first. If you're driving, here's what you can do. But I think that it makes me feel like the place I'm going to is like seeing a lot of different types of people who want to participate in that event.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great idea. I definitely feel much more seen by a doctor's office that lists transit directions at all, right? And not just nearest freeway exits.
Yeah, one from Jeff.
Yeah.
Hi. I think it needs a celebrity endorsement. I think it needs to appear in film. Like, I think it's a cultural and a behavioral choice. And yeah, I feel like in some ways we're all focusing on the like rational reasons to make the right choice, but as an emotional decision, maybe we're kind of forgetting that it's also an emotional decision, and yeah, maybe having people that others look up to or just seeing it in like the popular media would matter.
Thank you. All right. We got another one. Okay.
Oh, Anna, do I have an idea how do we make visible and normalize non-driving? And that is very simple. Put non-drivers on transit boards.
All right, we're going to get there. We're going to get there right now. Okay. Joe, you're like helping all my slide transitions. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the Non-Drivers Alliance and the work we're doing and how, you know, our sort of theory of change and how this happens. Change who gets invited to sit at the table is the text on this next slide. And this is a picture from a walk roll event organized by WashDOT a couple of years ago. This was in the Vancouver area where we brought community members with disabilities together with some of their traffic and planning folks from the region to talk about. We actually were crossing a freeway underpass that had recently been redesigned to help pedestrians and to try to actually see if that was going to work. So some of the work that we're doing at the Non-Drivers Alliance right now is this what Joe was talking about, valuing the expertise of non-drivers. This image on the back of this slide is transit boards in Washington State that are organized under the PTBA structure, which is a taxing authority. We passed a law last year at Disability Rights Washington to allow transit agencies that are organized under this PTBA structure, which is many but not all of the transit agencies in Washington State, to add 2 voting seats to their boards. One for someone who relies on transit and one for a person who represents an organization that serves a transit-reliant population. Not a single transit agency has taken us up yet on this change. So that's some of the work we're doing right now, is bringing together and helping transit agency leaders see that there is a lot of knowledge and expertise that comes from having someone who actually rides the bus or rides paratransit in the room when you're discussing what needs to change to make people want to ride transit in your agency or in your system, right? Or if you have to do budget cuts or system expansions, how that's going to work. So that's one of the campaigns we're working on. We're kind of going around it because the answer so far has been a hard no from pretty much everywhere, which is unfortunate. We are trying to break them down slowly by getting to know their transit board members who are currently elected officials and building relationships with those elected officials and helping them, first of all, ride transit through the Week Without Driving Challenge, and also to sort of understand how much they don't know about the lived experience of other people, perhaps people with disabilities who ride transit, people with different kinds of disabilities, so that they can start to see the value in adding those voices to the transit board. So the Week Without Driving, if you're not familiar, it's an event we launched back in 2021 here in Washington State. It's now a national and international event that takes place annually to invite folks to experience what it's like to be a non-driver in their communities. On the screen on the left, there's a bus route from Toledo, Ohio, that did that for Week Without Driving. It's a Week Without Driving bus strap. I think that's pretty awesome. The Week Without Driving logo is in the middle, and on the right is some social media images from an elected leader in Washington State who noticed that her transit stop was too dark. And I love how she sort of drew on the image to indicate that. So I'm going to play a Week Without Driving video real quick, and then we're going to talk about how this connects to the work that you're interested in doing, the work of funding a connected sidewalk network, and the work of really making sure that all of us can get where we need to go, whether or not we can drive. But quick video before the end. Let's Let's see.
Next week marks day one of a week-long effort to get people who can drive or afford a car to experience what life is like without personal transportation.
Central Oregon Community College is taking part in the National Week Without Driving.
Advocates in the Coulee region are looking to spread awareness about the difficulties of people who can't own or drive a vehicle.
Now, many of us have cars and enjoy the privilege of driving to where we need to go when we want to. But according to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, 40% of residents in the city of La Crosse don't drive. Now, this can make life less accessible for non-drivers. In order to fully understand what life would be like without a car and how our public transportation system can improve, there is a challenge to Try Not Driving.
The group is inviting the public to participate in its Week Without Driving campaign. According to Living Streets Lexington, 1/3 of the city's residents are unable to drive.
Getting to work, buying groceries, making a doctor's appointment without a car, it's a daily reality for them. And in a society like ours built around vehicles, it can present some serious challenges.
Mesa County Regional Transportation Office urges you to consider what it'd be like to try to get to an appointment or go to work without your own car.
Grand Valley Transit is inviting community members to join them in a Week Without Driving, an event that lets the community consider the everyday reality of those who don't drive.
It starts Monday and will let Austinites who have cars experience the city through the lens of non-drivers.
Next week really is an eye-opening opportunity to see our city and our transportation system in a different way and to build empathy for the thousands of Austinites who don't drive.
The Idaho Walk Bike Alliance is challenging people in Pocatello to ditch their cars this week.
A Week Without Driving campaign focuses on advocating for more accessible and inclusive transportation options.
This week kind of gives you a glimpse in how many things you can do without actually getting in your vehicle. Give it a shot and see what it's like to go 1 week without driving.
The North Coast is taking part in the annual Week Without Driving. This initiative challenges residents, especially local leaders and decision makers, to step into the shoes of community members who can't drive.
The Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities, along with several partner organizations, are behind the annual event. The goal is to help people experience the challenges non-drivers face in rural areas like Humboldt, where public transportation options are limited.
For 1 full week, Santa Cruz County and Metro are encouraging people to find other ways to get around. Throughout the week, council members from across the county and county supervisors will be riding the bus to get first-hand experience in hopes of remembering their own experiences when voting on infrastructure funding.
All right. Oops, and it wants to play again. So that is, I don't know. Oh, that's the end. Let me put this back on slideshow mode so you don't get to see my current amazing screen. So that's Week Without Driving, and I would say, as far as impacts, we were just talking about Ryther. Senator Emily Wicks, Washington State, I think a senator, yeah. She was from Representative, there we go. Thank you, Joe. Rep. Emily Wicks walked to Ryther during Week Without Driving, and I think she was wearing heels, and she described having to take her heels off as she tried to get down this staircase to cross highway to Lake City Way there, and walk in her stocking feet. And she did that on the floor of the legislature, and I think it's part of the reason that project moved as quickly as it did, to have that sort of highlight and that priority of that experience of an elected leader. So know that it has made impacts here and in other places. I want to open it up now. We have about, 5 minutes before we split into a deeper conversation in smaller groups. But thinking about, what you heard today, what I just shared here, what are the ways that we can start to make a change? What ideas do you have? What has inspired you that you've heard? And what do you think the barriers are, the challenges that we need to sort of start to hash out together in this space? And before I actually open that up, I'm going to describe this image. This is an image from a Walk Roll event that we hosted with the Tasker Center and with Tacoma on the Go and with Pierce Transit. A couple weeks ago in February, looking at the Spanaway Transit Center and some of the connections and lack of pedestrian access to that new transit center. So that's the image on the screen. There's also an image of my book, as well as my contact information, which is Anna at nondrivers.org and nondrivers.org. So yeah, opening it up. What have you learned today that has made you think, or what questions do you have for this group? Anybody? Anyone not named Joe? We play this game on we have Nondrivers Alliance has weekly meetings where we, as non-drivers, from around the state get together and talk about policy issues, have guest speakers, and it's a game we play. Anyone not named Joe for our first questions? You guys are being quiet. All right, are we ready to split into groups then?
Hi there. Well, since no one wanted to go first, I guess I'd draw the straw. A couple of thoughts very quickly. First, I knew Representative Emily Wicks when we were working together on making sure we had remote access to meetings, public meetings, during the pandemic. And it took a pandemic for a lot of these transit agencies and other agencies to realize it was very possible. And without going into too many particulars, there are some transit agencies not terribly comfortable with public participation or all for multiple reasons. And again, we're short on time, so come see me after. It took Representative Wicks and I and the pandemic to really make that happen. And I think we're going to be in that same place as to getting transit riders on these boards, where we're going to have to really make it mandatory if we don't have a diplomatic breakthrough somewhere soon. Because when we're up there giving public comment, it's only 2 minutes, 3 minutes, because some may want to hear from us, some may not want to hear from us, but at the end of the day, they got to run their business meeting, and they got other meetings, and I've constantly caught them driving to and from the board meetings. So they don't understand that if you don't get there to your bus stop 5 minutes early, you may not have a ride for an hour, and you may totally miss your appointment. So that's something for us to think about.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, one thing we are considering doing in some other places, Atlanta, Georgia, there was an advocate there who pulled the transit ridership records of everyone on their transit board based on the free passes they'd gotten, because that's a public record, and so and found that ridership among transit board members was really low. So we may start asking our transit board members in transit agencies across the state to share with us when was the last time they rode transit, right? And start to track that. There are places that actually require it, like in the Philippines and Manila, which I would love to see here, where transit agency staff and transit board leadership is expected to ride transit on a weekly basis, at least once, which I think would be pretty amazing. But it's a big lift. So, all right, other thoughts?
Yep, we've got one over here.
Yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to ask a question about you as an author, and I'm curious, like, what changed for you after you published this book? Did people take your ideas more seriously or something like that?
I definitely think there's been sort of a pushback around initially, right? Oh, there can't actually be that many people who don't drive. Like, that number isn't real. And it was, it had been based on the research from Washington State, which was conducted by Toole and Cascadia. Like, it was real research. But there was still so much sort of pushback from more established transportation industry folks. And I think as the book has gotten out there, and as, we've been talking about it, as Week Without Driving has really grown, it's become much more normalized. I see that non-driver the existence of non-drivers is something that's highlighted in a lot of progressive spaces talking about transportation access, like the War on Cars book. Sarah Goodyear talks about it a lot. I've seen Yona Freemark mention it. And then the NRDC research that came out last fall really validated what we'd seen in other research from Washington and Wisconsin, but to have national research from NRDC is awesome. I know UC Davis is working on similar research, which hasn't published yet, but is coming up with similar numbers as well. And so that's cool. That's really exciting to see that become more visible.
I have, hi, this is Taryn at King County Metro again. I just think what is interesting and often gets left out of the conversation by transit agencies is one of the biggest metrics that transit agencies measures is revenue. And ridership equals revenue, and it's incredibly important to be able to run a transit agency of make money off of fares. And yet accessible transit and accessibility doesn't always translate into more revenue. If there's 40% or 30% of the region doesn't drive or can't drive, and we're not making transit accessible, then we're missing out on a lot of revenue. That's something I try to bring up a lot. Accessibility is we can make money off of that.
Yep, definitely. And there's the other part of that too, is like if we actually had, affordable housing close to where we lived and services close to where we lived, maybe we would need less transit trips, which would maybe decrease revenue. But like, as a society, how could that benefit us? I want to maybe pick on Thomas, Craig, and Kurt from WashDOT to talk a little bit about they talked about yesterday, and I'm not sure everyone was here in the room, but the statewide access map that we're looking at, transit access, like what destinations can people access, right? And how, I'm going to pick on you guys a little bit, but like, what would it take to get us to a state where no matter where you can afford to live, you still have access to key services? How do we get there? And how far away are we?
Well, our June report will, provide something of a baseline to answer that second question of how close we are. And, Kurt and I, of course, can measure that baseline and help our advisory group and the community we speak with think about the ways to communicate how far we have to go and what it would look like getting there. We can't, of course, assign the funding that and the policy changes that would get us there. But I guess one answer I would give to that question is that one of the reasons why we are working with this type of analysis process is precisely because of some of the solutions that you just hinted at with the access to transit comment and destinations within communities, is that more transit is an answer. It's not the only answer. There's also thinking about how our communities are designed and where people live relative to the destinations that they need to travel to. And part of the opportunity behind this approach of measuring access is that we can start to not just draw more route lines on the map and say how much more access could we get by adding this much more service, but we can also start to ask questions like, what happens if there's more density here? What happens if there's more medical centers and urgent care facilities in these places that currently don't have that? How can we move the needle both by changing the land use and the transportation? And we need to be thinking about both sides of that equation in order to address that issue. Hopefully that's something of an answer.
Yeah. No, thanks. And then I think that gets to, when I was on Monday, I was in Skagit County in Cedar-Woolley doing a walk with some of the elected officials there. And one of the elected officials who represents the downtown Cedar-Woolley area, which is really like charming downtown that's, very walkable and dense, was like, with this sidewalk data that we're looking at, how can we use this to make sure that, like, because I represent the downtown, I want people to come downtown and walk around downtown and access services downtown. And so, part of it is also, where those services are, right, where the transit is, but also is that sidewalk network connected, right? And where are the places we need to patch to make sure that people can get, to the maximum number of destinations possible, no matter, what mode they're using and what disabilities they might have. So, all right, I know I'm at time. I want to turn it back over to Anat, maybe. Oh, Anat's in the other room. All right, I think we're going to break back into smaller groups for some ongoing discussion. And Anat's going to get grabbed here. Does anyone have any last questions or comments before we wrap up? Last questions, comments. All right.
Anna?
Yes.
Oh, if we need to go to the next thing, feel free. Okay. One of your slides you asked about how do we make non-driving more visible, and one of the answers was we need to have a celebrity be our spokesperson. And it got me thinking and I'm curious your perspective on it. So your work is really around the people who need to use transit to get around or to get around without a car, so very needs-based. But a lot of our work is also, within the transit space, is also just getting choice riders on board. And the dominant frame that we see on TV or movies is that somebody who, it's a corollary to show somebody on a bus or walking to a destination or riding a bike as immaturity, as being in poverty, as being down on your luck, right? That's the dominant frame. It's easy to show someone doing those activities, and the viewer interprets it as that person is less than in some sort of way. And then the whole story narrative is about that's overcoming that situation. It is very rare that somebody is driving a car stuck in traffic and they end up on a train, and it's an amazing story in that realm. So, but that issue is really around choice riders, right? And so I'm curious, as you do your advocacy, do you concern yourself about that dominant frame and that we need to change that dominant frame? Or are you more focused on providing visibility towards those who are actually down on the luck and that we need to have a transportation system that works for them?
Yeah, this is like a big meaty discussion, and I think it's really interesting to talk about. I mean, choice riders are also non-drivers, right? Like choice transit riders, like choice non-drivers, and are part of this sort of broad coalition. And I think much of what has grown Week Without Driving is groups that are bike advocacy groups, where most of the people are there because they want to bike places, not because they have to, right? So I think having having us work together is really important. But I think it's important too for some of these groups that are more focused on choice riders to recognize that there are many involuntary non-drivers, and that those perspectives aren't often in the room because involuntary drivers probably aren't able to get there, right? That the transportation barriers, for whatever reason, especially with people with disabilities, can be really large, and then the other just inaccessibility barriers or life barriers that make it really hard. And so, when you go to a bike advocacy conference anywhere in North America, it is not going to have that same focus around disability and not have as many disabled folks in that space. And I think there is a lot to be learned from centering the disability piece and from making sure that we have solutions that work for people with disabilities, and we don't get that unless people with disabilities are in the room. So my sort of frame is yes, there is this narrative that it's only involuntary non-drivers who are non-drivers in America, and our lives suck, and life is miserable and poor us, and and then how do we change that to be yes, I am an involuntary driver, and yet I figured out in a very hostile environment and a very car-dependent environment how to make it work. And here's how you, as someone with more choices, could make it work too, and sort of become role models and aspirational for other people who also want to drive less. And so that's the needle I'm trying to thread right now. But I do think it is tricky because there is so much. It is not always easy, right, to be in a car dependent place and try to get around. And most likely the people who have it easiest are people with resources, right, to move somewhere where there's more choices. And so having that conversation is complicated. Yeah. Thanks. I'm happy to talk more about it too, because I think it's a really interesting point. And I think there's also a political, I'll just add one more thing, there's a political advantage to not having it just be people with a lot of choices who are part of the coalition that's asking for change. And there's a political power in organizing And then finally, like, there's those of us who can't drive and are never going to be able to drive are pretty darn committed to making a system work better, like, because we're not going to, I mean, maybe we'll burn out of advocacy, but like we're still going to be riding the bus. Like we still are going to want it to work better. And so that sort of commitment and passion for something that's not going to change when we, you know, get married and have a kid and move to the suburbs and get a car, because that's not going to happen for us. So, yes.